I come from a tradition of making things in a workshop. These workshops were at home or very close to home. My grandfather specialized in the making of wooden doors and windows, and his workshop was on a property next to his house. My father still manufactures his mailboxes at home, and my great-uncle ran a welding workshop also on the property next to his house. I remember walking a short distance from my primary school to my uncle's workshop, where I would wait for my father to pick me up. While there, I couldn't really get to do anything in the workshop, so I would sit in the store's room, and I would pretend to be a store's assistant, logging in and logging out tools. There was no way my uncle was going to allow me anywhere near fabrication. In those days, my dad made each mailbox by hand, and sometimes I sat on a small wooden bench where I would help him paint them in their classic red oxide color. I'm sure most of you are familiar with them. They have a hexagonal barrel top that you can place large envelopes or magazines into. The thing is, as I got older, somehow, I didn't want to do any dirty work. What I really mean is, I never connected with the idea of working with my hands in a workshop, having to grind, cut, and weld and bend sheet metal. But I also think I was going to secondary school at a time when everyone was being pushed away from vocations and towards academic careers. So somehow being a craftsman didn't seem aspirational. And I also think my parents never really pushed me towards it. Working class parents have, their own sense of what success means for their kids. Now, I was doing well in art, yet I really had no sense of what I wanted to become. Then there was this one afternoon, I was walking from school, and I saw this yard filled of yards and yards of fabric, tie-dyed and some screen printed. I would inquire and eventually do a course in fabric design, which included screen printing. I think this was my first kind of formal introduction into the idea of design. After graduating from high school, I would enroll at John Donaldson Technical Institute, now the University of Trinidad and Tobago, to study graphic design part-time. But lo and behold, 2 years later, I will end up in a workshop. You see, a friend of mine was working at a sign company at the time, and he suggested that I should apply for the role of graphic designer. I did, and I got the job. The truth is I kind of really needed the cash, so I decided I would do it anyway. Now, in that time, it was really interesting for me as a young designer, because for the first time, I was beginning to understand the relationship between design and manufacturing. I was exposed to different types of materials and ways of making, and this had a really fantastic impact on who I am. How many of you have ever seen neon being blown to form letters or decorative elements? Well, you have to draw all of the neon in reverse, particularly the letter forms or designs that are not asymmetrical. Because that way, the neon fabricator can actually bend the neon with the glass facing them. Well, unfortunately, one day I did not draw it in reverse. So it was a really kind of tough day at the studio. I got really cussed out. By 2008, I was working in advertising. And you can see I was running away from the workshop again. And sometime later, I decided I would like to design a calling card that could promote myself for independent design projects. But I didn't want to design a typical calling card. So I thought, why not design an object that can communicate the idea that design is a play between intent and intuition? Think of it as the brain, the left side and right side of the brain continuously at play. As I said earlier, I worked in an environment where everything was translated into physical forms, so I felt compelled to do so. I made this paper model, and by chance, one day, it fell off the desk and continued rolling, and everyone in the studio laughed. For me, in that moment, the object had kinetic properties that I had not really imagined, I had not anticipated. Coincidentally, a friend of mine shared with me a call for entries for design exhibition in New Orleans. And I thought, well, this thing could roll. Maybe I can scale the object up and submit it. The deadline was looming, and I had limited resources. So I made this prototype using plywood and simple tools. I named it Verb, a doing thing, a multifunctional object that can be many things. A coffee table, a bench, a headrest, or even a toy that can be moved between two persons. In 2016, I made this other iteration using more sophisticated ways of making. This was shown at Milan Design Week for my project exhibition, and it was the first time I had shown internationally. Then one day, I saw this cardboard box, which is really a packaging for detergent. And somehow I thought, if you flip it, it could be a bench. But what I was really intrigued by was actually its construction, the way in which it had a kind of a structural integrity that allowed the packaging to be stacked. This is my dad's Pira. He uses it in the workshop as well as in the garden. For those of you who may not be familiar with what a Pira or Pira is, it's a small wooden bench traditionally used for Hindu weddings so the bride and groom can sit low, or more commonly used for doing tasks that require you to sit low. Somehow I connected the Pira and this cardboard box, and I thought, how can I reinterpret the familiar bench? But how was I going to make it? What materials was I going to use? And then I turned to my father's mailbox, because the folding of paper is somewhat no different from the folding of sheet metal. And I thought, maybe I can use that method. This is the first iteration I made. It was sturdy, I can stand on it, but it was made out of galvanized, which meant it was pretty heavy. And I thought, this needs to be something that's light enough so people can carry it around. Then I remembered while I was working at the sign company, I had worked with aluminum and CNC cutting. And CNC cutting is basically a computerized form of cutting. Now, what's also good for me is that because I have no real skills in the workshop, I can draw everything digitally and then have them cut by the computer. And then I can be folded in my father's shop. And what's interesting is that somehow I was intuitively connecting traditional ways of making and new technologies in manufacturing. This is what I made. I named it Pira, but spelled P-E-E-R-A. I later found out that P-E-E-R-A is actually a small Indian sweet, which I think is spot on. Then one day, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine, the architect Sean Leonard, and we were talking about how people are living in smaller and smaller spaces. And we demand more from the objects that we live with. And because of limited resources, we sometimes improvise. And I think he asked a really important question that day. He basically said, how can I continue to explore the idea of multifunctional as I had done with Verb? This was my response. I made a wooden box that's also a bench. When you put the two objects together, there's a kind of ambiguity. The bench basically disappears. Is it a toolbox? Is it a picnic box? What is it? As you can see, the wooden box has a handle, which can be dropped, which allows it to actually be the two benches. So you can sit on it, you can carry it around. For you, if you want to be a toolbox, it can be a toolbox. So here I am, reinterpreting a familiar object. But for me, it's really the combination of the materials used by my father and my grandfather. A clear and literal convergence of my practice as a designer and their traditions of making to create something that's new and surprising. This was the moment I really got my hands dirty. I no longer felt restricted by my family histories and my ideas of what I wanted to become. Instead, I embraced it, and I saw it as a portal to my creative freedom. Pira was shown at the Museum of Art and Design in New York for the Global Africa project in 2010. It quickly garnered a few digital online press. Here's a quote from Gizmodo, the design and technology magazine. I'm still waiting on the sandwich. From here on, I was moving beyond my family traditions, becoming very interested in the relationship between traditional workshops and modern design. I was engaging with many craftsmen and building many relationships and understanding how things are manufactured in different ways that are available here locally. I'd like to show you a few projects that show the result of these engagements. This is dish out, as in the act of serving. So they're salad servers, formed with stainless steel and turned in mahogany handles. This is out in, as in an inside and outside bench. As you can see, I'm playing with vernacular, right? Kind of the way we speak. This is charm. Some have said the sexiest subject I've ever designed. What's really interesting about this project is that the center of the table actually has a hidden storage unit. And it's designed for a family with small kids. This allows the kids to play, draw, color, build puzzles, and quickly, when it's time for dinner, they can put everything in the storage unit. That's a little draw there. This is scene. Like making a scene, as we say here in Trinidad. It's a little table that connects both units. This is the MR table, the Midnight Robber table. I was further exploring this whole idea of our traditional characters and looked to the Mokojombi. And I thought, how is it possible to translate the relationship between the stilts and the human form? And how can Pira possibly be expressed based on this? And this is what I made. So it's a small bench that sits on wooden stilts. So Pira is elevated, it takes on another personality. And it's also a good way to store your Pira. Somehow, I couldn't get my father's mailboxes off my mind. And I kept wondering, how can I translate his mailbox into an actual product rather than only using his methods of making for my own purpose? And in thinking of it, you think of a mailbox, it's basically a container. And in removing the lid, I began to experiment with what can it be. So here I'm in my studio, sketching, I'm modeling. See, it looks like a flower. These are hanging systems. And then I went to my dad's workshop where I prototyped. Then collaborated to further develop the design based on the data gathered from the actual prototype that we made. I was fortunate to engage with a large local manufacturer. And this allowed for the product to be developed to be taken to market using new technologies in manufacturing. This is Bloom. You can hang it, stake it, or place it on a table. So in this project, there are many things happening. For me, a culmination of all the activities over the years. It's both an expression of my family traditions and my expression as a designer. It also shows the relationship between design, traditional making, and new technologies in manufacturing. And for me, it shows that drawing from tradition can lead to the unimaginable. And as a designer, I found myself in the role of bridging the past and the present to create a future. Thank you.